Um, so I want to start with a demo. Some of you have seen this demo, I'm sure. Uh, but some may not have seen it. So um, let's just let's just go through it. And if you've seen it, don't say anything because I think it's still helpful. Uh, so this is a study, and it says count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball, right? There are two teams. One team is wearing black, one team is wearing white. Count how many times the players that are wearing white are passing the ball. So how many times was it? 16. So as I said, some of you have seen this, but it's a powerful demonstration of something. It's 15, but that's besides the point. So, but did you see a gorilla? The ones who had not seen this, did you see a gorilla? Okay, so we're gonna go back. We're gonna go back, and now you'll see it. It's coming from the right side. So it's a good introduction to the topic of today, which is attention. Um, so attention is an important topic in cognitive neuroscience. Is one of the most well studied. It's still a very complicated topic. There's no, um, I mean, there are a lot of theories and people are thinking about it, but it's an ongoing research. Um, and a lot of lectures about attention start with this code, and I think it's relevant for you to get a sense of it. Um, William James famously said, "Everyone knows what attention is. It is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seem several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others, as you saw just now, right? You're withdrawing from a lot of information in order to deal with what the task is. And is a condition which has a real opposite in the confused, dazed, and scatterbrained state." So we all know what attention is based on this definition. It's like you are attending to what I'm saying right now. Maybe a moment later, you're attending to the pressure of the seat on your back, or to something else, or a sound that is coming from the outside, or something, right? You could see that your mind takes possession of something that it can engage with and then moves on to something else and moves up to something else. And whenever you do that, you're doing it at a cost. You're doing it at a cost to something else. So this is a very broad definition of attention. Almost somebody would argue this is almost the same as conscious experience or as awareness or something like that. Those things also are about taking possession um, of something that we're experiencing in a form that is like it takes over our brain and it comes at a cost. Now, attention, and again, in this definition of it, is like a limited resource. Now, some people would argue against that, but that's a metaphor that could work for some of you. That you have some of it, you could give it to different things, and you could not give it to other things. Something of a resource makes sense to some people. So the example that William James, the process that William James is describing is what we call selective attention. This is really our focus, our ability to focus processing on a particular thing and ignore other stuff, right? When we're trying to study, when you're trying to pay attention to someone, what someone's saying in a crowded party or something like that, right? You're focusing, you're trying to process only a certain type of information and ignore other stuff. That is selective attention. And we're going to talk mostly about that. There's also something of a divided attention where you try to track multiple objects, for example, at once. You try to do, but that's under very limited conditions, and it's studied in the laboratory, but it's not something that we're going to spend time on. It's about a lot of it has to do with multiple object tracking, or if you're really trained athlete or a trained, uh, race car, right? Where you've learned to be able to track multiple things, to divide your attention on multiple things, and try to respond to them in a selective way. But as I said, mostly we're going to talk about selective attention. What is the consequence of giving something your attention? So what are the consequences? Well, there's a famous study by Posner, and it's a spatial queuing paradigm, and this was used a lot. Where you get a queue, right? You have lights, potential locations for light to come on either side of your fixation point. At the fixation point, you get cues. And these cues tell you sometimes if which side the light gonna appear. So some of the cues are valid cues. So when you get this cue, the light is actually appearing on that side of the visual world. This is an invalid cue, that you get a cue in some direction, but the light appears on the other side. And then you get neutral cue. Now we could look at how fast people respond to the light depending on the cue paradigm. If the cue is valid, in neutral or invalid, and this is the reaction time, this is the time it takes for the participant to respond to the existence of the light. What you could see here is that when the cue is valid, when people expect the light to appear in a certain side, they're much faster responding to it than when it's invalid. When their spatial attention is in a certain area, but the cue appears in a different area. And neutral is somewhere in between. So you could see all the three things that we talked about in terms of, well, if I get a cue in this direction and my attention is in this side, then it comes at a cost. Because when the cue appears on the other, when the light appears on the other side, I'm going to be even much worse than when I got a neutral cue. When I got a neutral cue, it didn't make it like it was somewhere in between. So invalid cue would take you longer to respond than a neutral cue. So validly cued lights were detected faster than neutrally cued lights, which were detected faster than invalidly cued lights. This is what we call spatial attention in a lot of ways, right? This is when a subject is sitting there, they choose to attend to certain part of their space. And you kind of have a lot of experience with this in life too, that you are expecting, you're attending to a certain area of the space, and you're more likely to react to it. And when it's something that you didn't expect, or it's in an area that you didn't expect, you're less likely to react to it. So this means that basically, did I have the line for it? Okay. So this means that attention to a location in space, it speeds up the processing of information at that location. So the outcome of this study is that attention, so these are different consequences of attention that we're trying to talk about, right? So we're saying that attending to certain area in a space, it speeds up the processing. You could process information coming from that part of a space much quicker, right? This is so far when we talked about processing or object recognition, we really didn't worry about these sorts of things like expectation or attention, right? We didn't worry about any of those things. What we talked about was that, well, the visual input comes up, the information goes through, right? And it reaches your IT or reaches your other, color perception area or motion perception area, and their activation becomes your person. We did not talk about how certain part of the space could be prioritized based on expectation or attention or the other stuff. But this is something that we're adding in this lecture, that, well, your expectation matters. What you expect to see changes. We talked a little about top-down expectation in the context of toward the end of the object recognition, but we're talking more about it here. So what is another consequence of giving something your attention? What's called inattentional blindness. Now, the example of invisible gorilla that you saw is a prime example of inattentional blindness. This is when you're engaged in an attention-demanding task, and the task of counting the number of passes was very demanding. You were just trying to track the ball. There were multiple people, so that was really attention-demanding. You often fail to notice irrelevant but even salient visual stimuli, right? The gorilla coming and then going, it's a very salient event. But because you're attending to something else, it comes at a cost. And the cost is that, well, you're not processing everything else in the world, right? So this is, again, a little different from how we were thinking about it. The way we were thinking about it so far is that, well, visual input comes, it goes to the retina, it all projects to V1, and it's all being processed in parallel, and then it goes up to hierarchy. But it's not that simple. So a study, and this is done by Mack and Rock, and Ariane Mack was here at New School, and she retired, I think, a couple of years ago, right? So the subject, so the study was, you create an attention-demanding task. And in this case, the attention-demanding task was that indicate which arm was longer. Is it the vertical arm or the horizontal arm? And here it looks the vertical arm, right? You have a few trials, and then while people are doing this task, you flash an object on the screen. And then later on, you ask people, what was the object that flashed? And most people were at chance, right? Because they're doing an attention-demanding task. So when something else appears in the screen, they're not able to process that information. So they're not really able to tell you what was the object that they saw. Does that make sense? So this is a good example of inattentional blindness. If people are doing a really attention-demanding task, it's likely that they miss a lot of things. And again, this could be, you could think of it in life too, right? When you are really consumed by something and it's attention demanding, then you miss some really simple, salient stuff, and then you realize, oh, how did I miss that? Or how did I not pay attention to that? And also inattentional blindness is something, as, texting and driving, right? There's a lot of, when we talk about selective attention, you could think of a bigger context of, well, can we really engage in that way with more than one thing? Some people would argue no. Like some people strongly argue that multitasking is a myth, right? That you really are engaging with one thing. You could task switch a lot, as we do, but that's not beneficial. It's not productive. It's best to focus on one thing and then do that one thing, and then switch to another task and then spend time on that. This sort of multitasking is not, again, depends on the task. If you're doing a task that is not attention demanding, like, I don't know, folding a laundry or something, and then you're listening to something, then that's a different story, right? Tasks that you could do without too much attention, then you could do them with something else. But if there are two different tasks, like driving and texting, and both of them are very attention demanding, and you can't really do them at the same time. Yeah. So attention is really needed for object to reach awareness. These sorts of blindness that we see in these examples are because really we needed attention in order to actually engage with those objects, to remember them later. All of those things required us to attend to them. And again, this definition becomes a little, again, goes in this direction of awareness and conscious experience and a lot of those things. And a lot of people who wanted to study consciousness but couldn't became attention researchers. You know, it's like a, because you couldn't study consciousness for a long time. And that's, yeah. And again, a lot of definitions just go in that direction. So just be aware of it, that attention could be as, you know, as simple as, oh, faster reaction time when I attended to a location and light appeared there, to your conscious experience, right? It spans that entire, for a lot of people. Okay. Before we start this, let's take a break for 10 minutes and then we'll come back to this. All right. So attention is needed for object to reach awareness. So this is a very seminal study on neural mechanisms of selective attention. So the type of attention that we've been looking at so far, which is, well, you're attending to one thing and you're trying to engage with that thing. And the thing that you're attending to is the thing that you're going to recognize, the things that you're going to remember, right? So what happens in the brain if I have two objects in front of me and I attend to one of them and don't attend to the other one? What happens in the brain, right? That's a good question to ask. And so far, we didn't really engage with that question. As I said, the way we engage with it is that, well, you have a visual input. This visual input goes through a feed-forward path. And that's how we thought about it. But let's say in the areas that have larger receptive field, right? So this is a single neuron. We're back to single neuron neurophysiology. If you have a single neuron and the single neuron has multiple objects in its receptive field, so far we haven't talked about that, right? We only talked about, well, we have a neuron, we have a visual stimulus, we look at what's in the receptive field. If the receptive field is really small, like in early areas, you'll have maybe an oriented bar or some other light pattern, and then you could decide, okay, what the response would be. But what we talked about is that as you go up the hierarchy, there would be higher and higher convergences. That means that the receptive field of area like a cell in area IT, which is at the top of the ventral pathway we talked about, is almost what? 1/3 or half of the visual field. So objects in half of the visual field can stimulate a cell in area IT. That creates another issue. The issue is that, well, if this cell is selective to faces, but there is a face, there's a chair, there's a car in the receptive field, how does this cell respond to it? Like, if all those objects are in there, this cell's response would not be the same as if there was only a face in front of it, right? If a person is close to me and their face is taking, 1/3 of my visual field, then, well, sure, this cell is responding to that face. But if they're a little distant from me and there are a lot of other objects in the visual field, how would this cell respond? I know, even if I know this cell is face selective, I wouldn't be able to tell because there are so many other objects. So in this case, imagine you're fixated here, and this is the receptive field of this cell, just the schematic. The receptive field doesn't look like that necessarily, like a rectangle somewhere. But this is the receptive field, and you have two objects in there. One is a horizontal green bar and a vertical blue bar. Now, people have found that when you have two objects, the response, and in this case, the blue one is the preferred stimulus, and the green one is the non-preferred stimulus for this cell. What does that mean? When I say the blue one is the preferred stimulus, the green one is non-preferred, what does that mean? Yes. So what does it mean for the firing rate of this cell? Higher for the preferred one. So it means that the green one, the blue one, would cause a higher firing rate in this cell compared to the green one. That's what it means. Now, when both of them are in the receptive field, the cell is kind of averaging the response. So when a preferred and a non-preferred stimulus falls in a receptive field, the neuron fires at an intermediate rate, reflecting the average of the two. So if you're not attending to anything and you have two objects appearing in the receptive field, the neuron responds somewhere in between. Right? There's a preferred stimulus, non-preferred stimulus, it responds somewhere in between. Response somewhere in between, these are firing rates. So these are firing of the cell. Now, if the monkey is instructed to attend to one of them, in this case, if it's instructed, so this is a monkey, they're rewarded by attending to one object or another object. So if the monkey attends to the blue stimulus, what happens is that the firing rate goes up. So if it attends to the preferred stimulus, the firing rate goes up. And that firing rate is comparable to as if that blue object appeared in isolation. So let's think about that. So if I have two objects in my receptive field, in this, we're talking about a single cell. In the single cell's receptive field, there are two objects. One of them is preferred, means that one of them really makes this cell fire. The other one is not preferred, so the cell is either at the baseline or is lower, a little higher than the baseline maybe. Now, if the two of them are there, you're going to have a response in between. But when the monkey attends to one of these objects, right? So when it is spatially attends to one of these objects, the firing rate of the cell, so the fixation point is here. So the monkey is not, what does that mean when the fixation point is still here? But the attended stimulus is here. What does it mean for the eye? No, so the fixation point stays constant during the experiment. It means what? It means that the monkey is not moving the eye. So the fixation point is here. So the monkey is fixated at that point, but it's attending covertly, and I explained what that means later on, right? It's attending without moving its eye. And I was saying that imagine you're in a party and someone says, there's someone at 3 o'clock, and then you try to look at them without moving your eye or something. And you're looking at someone and then you're attending. So I could attend still to this environment here without moving my eye, right? So that's what the monkey is doing. If the monkey moves their eye, there would be a big issue here. What would that issue be? What would be a big issue if the monkey moved their eye for this experiment? When we talk about receptive fields are retinotopic. But if I move my eye, what happens? If I have a cell and it has a receptive field, if I move my eye, the receptive field moves with it. Can you imagine why that happens? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Why does it make sense? Why does the receptive field move when I move my eye?
It creates another retinopathy.
Yeah, right. So let's say let's say a cell is getting input from a certain part in the retina. So the connectivity is that, okay, this patch in the retina goes to this part of my brain, and the receptive field is here. You could imagine if this is if I'm looking here and the object is here. If I'm looking here, the representation of this object moves to a different hemisphere, right? Because if I'm looking here and the object is here, it means that this object is going to which side of my brain? Which hemisphere? Left hemisphere. If I move my eye suddenly to this point, this representation changes where? My right hemisphere. So by move, like that's how much the visual input moves in my head by moving my eye. Everything's retina topic, and again, that's what makes that concept really important. That as you move your eye, as you move your body or your head in the environment, cells are not maintaining the receptive field. They cannot because their input changes completely because the input on the retina changes. So in a way, what they're looking at would be different. If the monkey moved here, then the receptive field would not be on this area of the screen anymore. It would be on a very different area. So you cannot continue with this experiment because the experiment requires that the receptive field be in this area in order for you to make your story that you want to make. Um, but think about what that means, meaning that so if I have my eye open and I have a cell in my left, and it so all the receptive field are relative to your fixation point in the environment. So a receptive field of a cell is, for example, 5 degrees to the right and 3 degrees, up. And as you move your eye, the receptive field kind of moves with it. So if I'm looking at different places in this space, the receptive field of a cell moves with it. This is because it's retinotopic. The image on the retina changes, and the receptive field change with them. So for an experiment like this, you require the monkey or the person to maintain fixation. If they don't, the receptive field changes for this specific cell that you're recording from. Okay, so the monkey is not moving their eye, but covertly attending to an object. And when they covertly attend to this blue object, the response goes up. So, and it's comparable to as if that object appeared in isolation. In a way, someone could say it's as if the receptive field kind of shrunk around that object. So by attending to an object, you're kind of, what you're doing, you're making the receptive field smaller. So as if I said, if I have a cell that is really has a wide area and then there's a face somewhere, there's a chair, there's a car, if I attend to the car, it's as if all the input for the cell is coming from that area. Well, receptive field is the area where the input comes from. And it's an as if statement. The receptive field doesn't really shrink. The cells responds in a way as if the receptive field shrunk around that object that I'm attending to. So if I'm attending to the face, because this cell is face selective, it's going to really go high up because the receptive field is kind of shrinking around that. All the input that impacts this cell kind of comes from that part of the world. Something like that. Now, alternatively, I'll talk about that. Alternatively, if the monkey attends to the non-preferred stimulus, what would you expect the response to be? Firing rate. Would you expect it to be higher than lower when there is no attention? Lower, right? Because if there is no attention, the response would be the average of the two, which is preferred and non-preferred. But when you're attending to the non-preferred stimulus, it's as if the receptive field shrinks around the non-preferred stimulus. So it's kind of comparable it when that non-preferred stimulus was appearing in isolation. So what attention does in this case, you could say that it biases that competition. Now, what is the competition for? The competition is for that representation, meaning that when you have different objects in the environment, they want to control the response of all cells. Or at least they want to control the response of the cells whose receptive field they fall in. So if they fall in the receptive field of a certain cell, they want to control that response. So it creates a competition because they have contradicting inputs to the cell, right? If the receptive field includes a face and a car and a chair and everything else, they have different types of input that is coming to the cell, so they're competing with one another for controlling the response of that cell. And that competition can be resolved with attention. So when you attend to one of them, in a way you're saying, okay, I want this object to control the response of the cell. But that doesn't mean that the response is going to go up because, well, what if that object is the non-preferred stimulus for this cell? Well, in that case, the response would go down because the cell is just responding to that object. Does that make sense to everyone? What does so here I'm saying attention biases competition among objects for representation. What do I mean by representation here? What is representation here? A spatial location in the receptive field. So representation, think about if there is an object in the visual world, this object could be represented in the brain. How? Okay, yeah. So the only way that an object could be represented in the brain is through response of the cells. So if I have a face in front of me, this cell would be represented in my brain how? Well, I have a fusiform face area, but there are a lot of other areas in my visual hierarchy that we talked about, V1, V2, right? V4. All of those areas are activating how? Representing this object, right? Their response reflects this object because this is the only object that is in front of me. And because of that activation, I could perceive this object. I could memorize this object. I could report something about the object, right? I could answer questions about it. If you show me an image of a person, and then you take the image away and then ask me how old was that person. Well, what am I answering that based on? I'm answering that based on the neural representation of that visual input. That visual input caused some neural representation in my head, in the hierarchy everywhere, and then I can answer that question about it. That's what representation is. Does that make sense? Kind of representing that object. That object lives in the outside world with physical properties, but I am representing that object in my head with neural activity. So the neural activity matches that object. Yeah? Are you all clear on the concept of representation? The objects are being represented, but there's so much tissue in the brain that could represent the world. If there are multiple objects in the world, then they would be competing. They would be competing. So if they're all in the receptive field of one cell, they'd be competing one another. Who gets to, who gets to control the response of this cell? Because cells, when you go up the hierarchy, they respond to multiple different things. And they don't just respond to one thing. So you want to have a representation of one object versus another object. Now, attention biases this competition. That's why it's called biased competition theory. That attention biases competition among objects for representation. Are you clear what that sentence means? This is a very loaded sentence. Attention biases competition among objects for representation. It's important that you understand what that means. That it means, I'll go through it again. It means that you have multiple objects in the receptive field. Okay? These multiple objects, they want to control the response of the cell. They want to make this cell represent something about them, their color, their orientation, their identity. They want the cell to signal their presence. But the cell has multiple objects. But when you attend to one of them, then that cell actually does respond in a way that is representing that object. Yeah? Questions? Yeah. Yeah. So selective, I'm using the word selective here as you selecting something. So I'm using selective as we used it in this definition. So in a way, it's, you see, taking possession, selecting one thing among everything else. I'm using the word selection in that sense, that you as an individual, you could select one object versus other object. Okay? That's what I mean by selection, not necessarily. So for example, I'm selecting to attend to this sound, or I'm selecting to look at that face. That's sort of selection, what I'm talking about. So the selective attention we're talking about is attention to select one object versus other objects. And in this case, again, this is a schematic, but imagine there are two objects and attention selects one of them, right? So you want to attend to the blue vertical bar versus the red-green bar for whatever reason. Now, this could be a face and a car because, you're in the street and you want to make sure that the car doesn't hit you, so you're attending to the car. This is just a schematic to convey the point. But imagine this is a much more complex scene. You're walking around in the street in New York and there's a car coming, or people walking around, there's a bike coming. All of those things are happening, and you attend to one, and then another, and then another. So every time you attend to it, well, when you're crossing the street, you don't want to worry about the people on the side. You worry about the cars coming. So you're attending to the car. You're attending. So that's your selective attention process. Make sense? It's a little tricky, and when we talk about eye movement behavior, it becomes a little bit more clear. But it's tricky in this context because, as I said, this context requires you to maintain fixation because the receptive field stays constant in a certain area, so you could do the experiment. But in real world, we really move our eyes around in order to attend to different things. We don't really attend to stuff in the periphery all that much. Okay, so attention biases competition among object for representations. There is a competition. There's so much tissue in the brain. Different objects want to control that response, and attention does that. And attention basically modulates that competition. And this is called the bias competition theory of attention. Attending to a stimulus functionally, not literally, functionally restricts a neuron's receptive field to that stimulus. So when you're attending, if I have a car and a face, and imagine I'm on the street and there's a person on the car, and I'm attending to the car, In a way, all those neurons that had really large receptive field, in a way, they're trying to represent the car because the car is the most important thing right now. So let's represent the car. When you represent the car, what happens to the person information in my brain? If the cells that have both of them in their receptive field only representing the car, what happens to the person representation? And they're diminished. If the car representation is controlling a lot of neuron activity, it comes at a cost. No neurons or very few neurons are now only representing the person. That's the cost. That's the competition. Because imagine you have a bunch of neurons, and these neurons have very overlapping large receptive fields. And if they're all attending to one object, it means that very few of them are now responding in a way that signals to the rest of the brain information about the person. Because there is not enough tissue to represent all of them. Does that make sense to everyone now? It's a matter of tissue and competition, right? Brain, it's a trade-off that the brain does. The same trade-off you saw with foveal and peripheral. Well, how does the brain do that? Well, you saw it in that example. It creates foveal magnification. It loads the fovea with cones. It has lower convergence factor in the fovea. All of that comes at a cost. What is the cost of that? Well, you don't have really good perception in the periphery anymore. There's a cost when it makes the fovea really magnified, high resolution. Well, your periphery is not high resolution anymore. It's a trade-off that you accept. With attention in higher cognition, you accept a similar trade-off. You want to put your processing on one object in order to be able to process this object the best, and that comes at a cost. If you're doing a really attention demanding task like the counting the passes, comes at a cost. You're not representing all the other stuff that are happening anymore. You're ignoring them. So attention biases competition among objects for representation. I hope you all understand what that means now. So let's look at an example where they're working with real world objects or real world objects. It's a face and a house overlaid on top of each other, superimposed. Now you could ask people, and this is done in people, so you can nicely ask people to attend to one or another. Now we know that a lot of face selective cells are in the fusiform face area. A lot of place selective cells are in the parahippocampal place area. And this is a different area in the brain. What happens when you ask people to attend to face, and this is in the blue, and the house, which is green, and then there is a control condition where they're attending to the motion, but you don't have to worry about that for now. So just pay attention to the blue and green. So what would you expect to happen when people are attending to the face when it's superimposed with the house? What do you expect to happen in the fusiform face area? Activity goes up against a baseline. That's what you expect. You expect that when you attend to a face, those face selective cells become a lot more active. Or when you attend to the house, you expect the house selective to be more active. Now, this is not a very clean thing because one could be asking, well, when they were attending to the, even in the fusiform face area, so okay, let's explain this right. So this is the fusiform face area, FFA. This is the parahippocampal place area, PPA. So looking at FFA, when you attend to face versus house, you expect a bigger activity in FFA because FFA is face selective. When you in PPA, so the difference between this and this is irrelevant because these are different brain areas and different brain areas have different baseline and dynamics and whatnot. So don't worry about that. But in an area of the brain that is place selective, if you're attending to house, you expect that area to have higher activity versus when you're attending to faces. That difference is meaningful, and this difference is meaningful. So this is what people call object-based attention, because, well, these things are on top of each other, right? What I showed here is a spatial attention, because you're attending to an object in certain part of a space versus another part of a space. This is object-based attention because these objects are on top of each other. You're attending to one object versus another object. So it makes it object-based attention. And this is a meaningful difference, meaning that, okay, so if I have face selective cells, they're gonna have a higher activation because I'm attending to faces. So what happens there? Well, similar story happens. Those face selective cells have receptive fields that is covering this area. And if I'm attending to faces, only the response, the visual input from the face is controlling the responses. So the response of FFA goes up. If I'm attending versus when I'm attending to the house, because, well, these cells are not very selective for the house, so they're not, the responses is not going to go up. In PPA, which is a place selective area, if I'm attending to the faces versus I'm attending to the houses, well, when I'm attending to the house, these cells are selective for that. So the response is going to go up versus when I'm attending to the face, because the face is non-preferred stimulus. And when you average this out, this is fMRI. So when you average this out, you see this little percentage point difference between, 1% and 2% and stuff like that. This is the signal change, as we talked about it. The fMRI signal change is really 1.5%, 2%. It's not like a huge difference because it's really just recording blood flow. So it doesn't really give you a big difference.
If you stared at this for a while, would your brain like create this sort of perceptual self or a house space? Like, I mean, do you like kind of objects and they become?
I mean, if you like, what would be a house space? Like, it would.
You saw like a chimney coming out of the back, or I mean, like how someone would look at art that was abstract.
I see. Yeah. I think a lot of it probably has to do because these are such elementary, like such basic categories, houses and faces. I don't know if you would combine them, but I could imagine you would have cells that respond to different elements of these categories, a chimney or part of faces and stuff, and they could be combined to create new categories. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. So those sorts of abstraction we're really good at, right? To create a new abstraction of different elements. Um, yeah, but these are very robust findings in terms of FFA and PPA. Like a lot of people have found that they really replicate that the responses are selected to the faces or houses. But as I said, the idea is what? The idea is that what visual input is controlling the response. Controlling doesn't always mean increasing. See, this is important to internalize. When you control the response of the cell, it means that you could bring it lower because you're the non-preferred stimulus for that cell, or it's a more complicated pattern of activation. In this case, you could see that example when you're attending to, faces, you see higher activation in FFA versus not attending to faces in F, right? So it's the same visual input. The difference between these two is the same visual input. It's just that in one of them, your task changes. When one of them, your task is to attend to the face, and the other is to attend to the place. But because you have face selective cells in this area, the outcome is that this area would have higher activation because these are the preferred stimulus for that. All right, I'm not going to start a new thing. But we'll stop right here. And I'll see you all next week.